Welcome to part 3 of the unit on the Cold War. I know in the last one I said that this will probably be the last lesson, but looking over things a bit, this might need to be broken up into 2 parts itself, so this might be the third of 4 parts. And we'll see where we get to as we go along here. But hotspots of the Cold War. Now, the reason why we say hotspots of the Cold War is, well, the Cold War was cold because there was no actual fight or declared war between the Soviet Union and the United States, or NATO and the Warsaw Pact, even though there was a lot of stuff going on there that, like every other aspect of war is going on, not just you didn't have the gigantic armies out there. When we say hotspots, this is where, the fight between the U.S. and NATO versus the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact come to a head where, like, those two nations aren't necessarily fighting against each other directly, but they are still fighting against each other. You know, basically control over the world in different regions and stuff like that. So, and we call these hotspots throughout the Cold War. So, the very first main hotspot, like the big one, is the Korean War. This is one you should have learned about in U.S. history, so I'm not going to go and be delving deep into it. In fact, most of these hotspots, I'm not going to delve deep into it. It's more just introducing them to you. And if you want to learn more about them, please feel free to look them up. But basically what happens here is Korea was divided into 2 sides. That's still the way they are today, stemming from the beginning of the Cold War, or end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War in the 1940s. The northern half goes communist, the way that the Soviet Union wanted it to be, and the southern half goes democratic, the way that the United States wanted it to be. Now, there are some shenanigans going on both sides in this one. Again, if you want to go into it, feel free, but there are a lot of shenanigans on both sides. Both the Soviet Union and the U.S. are doing some kind of shady things, and the idea of just doing this, and they just decide, okay, just split it in half. Of course, Korean people don't like that as much. They want to be unified. At the same time, the communists want to be communists, and the people that were more for the democracy and liberty, no, we want that way. And of course, a war breaks out. North Korea, the communists decide to attack South Korea, and they just roll over them. The South Koreans are not ready for this. The UN, a new entity at this point, actually votes to go in and help out. The Soviet Union, by the way, wasn't there for that vote. Read into that one if you want. I wonder why they didn't show up for that one. And what were they wanting out of that? And there's a lot of good guesses as to what they wanted there, but anyways. So the United States goes in there along with allies like the Australians and other NATO members and save the South Koreans, kind of hold the North Koreans at bay, then start to push them back. And we don't just push them back up to the initial line, which is right here. They get pushed back all the way up to this green line right up here. And this is where it goes from being more to just like an internal civil war into a massive regional conflict, because China does get directly involved. China at this point is communist, and I'll be talking about that in the next unit, the unit on modern China. And they invade across that line, and they push us all the way back down here, basically. Then we push back at them, and to this day, that is what's known as the demilitarized zone. In fact, I just read an article yesterday in the local news how the South Korean and North Korean militaries exchanged fire again across that line. They do it a lot. They hadn't done it since 2018, but they exchanged live fire against each other. It could spark up a whole new civil war again. We hear about this a lot, so we don't think it will start up, but who knows when one of these times get a little bit out of hand. I'm talking about today in the year 2020 right now. But since that time, the war's never really ended, and the two sides both sides kind of view this as they're at war. South Korea and North Korea, and they have their allies. Technically, China is an ally of North Korea, although North Korea's been losing a bit of support from China, mainly because Kim Jong-un is just, crazy. So, yes, that's definitely Western bias there, but man, it seems like there's a lot of evidence going into it. So moving on from the Korean War, that's one of the first hotspots. What makes it a hotspot? I talked about China, I didn't talk about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gave most of their weapons to the North Koreans so they could just roll over the South Koreans. And you actually had a lot of Soviet pilots piloting the jets. They said that, oh no, North Koreans are piloting them. And we knew that the Soviets were piloting them, but if we admitted that they were piloting them, we would have had to declare, it would have been World War III. So it was one of those things where just like, that's not a Russian that I'm looking at in that cockpit. He's North Korean type of thing. So Anyways, same thing happens in the Vietnam War, by the way. So yes, we had fighting between Soviets and Americans. We just couldn't admit to it in that war. So Korea really was more of a global conflict than it was just a civil war. Okay. Now, getting into problems that the Soviet Union had. I'm going to be going a little bit back and forth between problems from the two sides and problems that NATO had, the United States had, and problems that the Soviet Union had. But here's going to be a couple for the Soviet Union we usually don't learn about. There was a massive worker revolt against the East German government and the Soviet Union overall. And it's at this point that the Soviets kind of put their foot down, and this is the way they are for the next couple decades. Like, if you want to complain, we're sending in the tanks. You want to complain now? Didn't think so. They put it down pretty quickly. So in Hungary, after Stalin dies, they think, oh, the mean guy's gone, the evil dictator's gone, we can get our freedom now. And so you have this huge Hungarian revolt in 1956. Doesn't matter that Stalin's dead, the Soviets still send in the tanks. By the way, I think I mentioned in one of the earlier videos, I think the first one, that my grandma and grandpa went to Hungary in the 1960s, like 10 years after this. My grandma talked about how eerie it was, how nobody talked with each other. Everybody whispered, because everybody knew that there were basically snitches everywhere, that if you said something even a little bit out of line and they're able to turn you in, that you would just disappear. And that's in the 1960s. She talked about most of the buildings hadn't been repaired and there was bullet holes everywhere. Like, she was freaked out going into Budapest, Hungary. My grandpa was like, "This is great. Look at all this. This is fun stuff." Like, in the middle of the Cold War. So, yeah. Anyways, I have a fun time talking to my grandma about that one. Another thing like this happens in Poland. Like, these were actually people that were pro-socialist. They just didn't like the way the Soviets did it. And the Soviets still moved in and said, nope, you got to do it our way. And they send in the tanks and like, all right, don't argue with us or you're dead. So basically it's just kind of the Soviet way of just responding to most everything. You want to complain? Say hi to my big friend with a huge 88mm cannon on the front of it. Or 121mm cannon. Your choice. Anyways. So now, problems for the United States. One of the biggest ones that comes up to us almost out of the blue. I mean, some people saw this coming, but out of the blue for most. Fidel Castro, a socialist, Marxist, communist, leads a revolution successfully and changes Cuba from a more democratic government into a communist government. And that's still the way Cuba is today. Cuba is still considered one of the official communist nations in the world today. And by the way, he's very anti-American, big time anti-American. Thing is that we realized that we didn't like having communist nations so close to us. What if they developed ties with the USSR, with the Soviet Union? That could be really bad. So we have what's called the Bay of Pigs, where we try to help Cuban rebels to land in there and retake the government. It fails miserably. And again, U.S. history should go into this more, but there's definitely those black eyes in the United States history. Just like, what were we doing? These guys trusted us and we kind of bailed on them. So, these rebels, that is. But that led into exactly what we were fearing. We were fearing that the USSR or the Soviet Union would use Cuba as kind of like, become an ally. And for a fact, they did start building nuclear silos, and we're going to move ICBMs, rockets with nuclear warheads on them, into Cuba, meaning that they were going to be right next to us, just like we were right next to them in places like West Germany and Turkey and Greece and Japan. Those are all countries surrounding the Soviet Union at the time. If you're looking from the Soviet point of view, it's like, this is just fair. Of course we should have a place that's right next to U-2. U-2. Sorry. The spy plane is called the U-2 spy plane that took this picture. Sorry. Anyways, knee slapper there. By the way, this is the ship that was carrying needed supplies for the Cubans, but we know for a fact that this ship was carrying nuclear warheads. And this is the ship that John F. Kennedy said, if that ship crosses a certain line in the ocean, on the maps, then we were going to declare war against the Soviet Union. And it was at the last second that Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, he's the guy that took over for Joseph Stalin after he died, he ordered those guys to turn around. So there's actually a fun X-Men movie that that's based off of this. One of the new X-Men, or the first of kind of like the new X-Men movies called X-Men First Class, is based off of this whole situation. Of course, they take a huge fantasy twist on it, but it's fun. So, now, the Six-Day War. I imagine most of you have not heard of this war before, but it is huge in just world history, not just in the region. This is actually a war where all the Arab states of the Middle East gang up on Israel to basically try to destroy it and knock it out. You need a little bit of background here. One of the worst things to happen in world history, which is considered part of World War II, is the Holocaust. And the main ethnic group of people targeted in the Holocaust for extermination were the Jews. So after that, you had President Truman of the United States and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, think that these guys, they've been picked on for millenniums. They need their own place. And historically, their homeland has been in, today it's called Israel, but in ancient Israel, or the Roman province of Judea and Palestine. And just so happened that Great Britain actually had control of that area. So they said, you know what, we're carving out a section of that, and we're going to call this the new homeland of the Jews. They've been picked on enough. Here's their new homeland. So Jews just flock to this new homeland. To many what are called Zionist Jews. The Lord's promised to them that they would be able to get back to their homeland. So of course, with that religious fervor behind it, hundreds of thousands have returned back to the homeland. The problem is that, well, there are Arabs there. It's not like they were just taking over space that nobody had. And of course, at first Great Britain said, you guys can get along, but I can't go into the history of this. There's a massive history there. It's like a big, giant family feud even going back thousands of years. These people just aren't going to get along. And this becomes a Cold War hotspot because Israel is tied to the United States and Great Britain, NATO nations. So the Soviet Union sees an opportunity to hurt us through hurting Israel. So the Soviet Union helps arm these Arab nations, and they decided once they have that backing, they can attack, which they wanted to anyways. By the way, they attacked before this, attacked multiple times. One of the big wars was the war in 1947 when Israel was first created, and the Jews were able to win that one, and they did it with superior force. This time it seems like the Arab nations have about equal force, meaning in military technology. But the Jews win this in 6 days. They beat everybody around them. Countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, they beat all of them, all the Arab states at one time. And in 6 days they do it. It was just a crazy victory, crazy awesome victory if you're on the Israeli side. A horrific loss if you're on the Arab side. It's like, what just happened to us? So, but this is considered a hot spot. This idea that it is still, even though this was a conflict that would have happened even without the Cold War, it still was influenced by the two sides, by the United States and Soviet Union. Hey, the Dominican Republic. This is one of those whoopsies in American history. You don't hear about this in U.S. history class as much. Like I didn't even in college. I didn't really hear about this more like a footnote. This is one of those cases where there was a very corrupt government in the place of the Dominican Republic, and it was corrupt. And a bunch of people decide they want to overthrow it and get a government that's more for the people in place. The United States hears this, and they hear a rumor that these guerrilla fighters, these rebels that are launching this coup against the government of the Dominican Republic, are Marxist socialists. They're going to do to the Dominican Republic exactly what Castro did to Cuba. So without really putting any more thought into it, we send in the Marines, and we put down this coup and save the corrupt government of the Dominican Republic. Just to find out later that most of these guys, some of them did have were hardcore socialist Marxists, but most of them were just people who are like, we don't like our corrupt government. We'd like a better government, please. It was kind of like, from the United States perspective, it was like, oh, sorry about that, because we helped the corrupt government stay in power. So, now, one of the biggest, arguably the biggest hotspot for us, for the United States, is the Vietnam War. Although, if you didn't know this was actually started by the French. The picture there, so when I was looking this up, those aren't American soldiers, even though they do have some American gear on them. Those are French soldiers on the outskirts of a fortress called Dien Bien Phu. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. I don't speak Vietnamese very well. But the French actually had control of what was called French Indochina, which Vietnam was a part of. Anyways, we supplied the French with everything, and even though we basically were helping French imperialism keep control of the area, mainly because of the whole idea of what's called the domino effect. We didn't want another nation to fall to communism. And if the French were there to keep it from being communist, great, because a lot of the rebels that were attacking them were communist. Not all of them. In fact, a great majority of the Vietnamese rebels were not communist, but a good portion were. The Dien Bien Phu is kind of like the French version of the Titanic. They said, "We'll never fall. It's too fortified. We'll never lose." Oh yeah, we lost. I'm laughing about this now, but yeah, this is something that the Vietnamese will still talk about most definitely. It's like we beat the unbeatable French fortress of Dien Bien Phu. And this is where the United States were like, okay, because it definitely obviously looked like Vietnam was going to become communist. That was the more forceful faction in creating a new government there. And so we move in and say, nope, if you want to be communist, you got to North Vietnam. If you want to not be communist, go to South Vietnam. And we split it just like Korea was split. And that goes bad pretty fast because North Vietnam invades South Vietnam just like North Korea invaded South Korea. It didn't help it though. This time though, the South Vietnamese government was incredibly corrupt. Like that, especially looking back on this, is like, yeah, you don't want to see the spread of communism, but it's like we're helping other bad guys too in the process. Like, the people that want freedom, like your average Joe in South Vietnam that wanted more of a free world, like they're really getting screwed over this whole thing. But we basically kind of put our foot down and we send troops in. We send our entire military in. We have the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident. Again, if you don't know what that is, go and look it up. Well, that's how we justify military intervention in Vietnam. And by the way, during the entire time that Vietnam's happening, it's just referred to as a conflict. Today we call it a war because we rightfully identify it as a war, but we didn't want to call it a war at the time. And a lot of people like to say that the United States has never been beaten in a war, like to point out the idea like, well, Vietnam was just a conflict, it wasn't a war, so we haven't been beaten in a war. Well, yeah, we were beaten, it sucked, and there's a lot of fallout from it. Not just in the idea of what happened, that Vietnam did turn communist, just some more pictures of things. I'm hoping you already know quite a bit about the Vietnam War. This is kind of bringing back stories you've heard about it. But even here at home, here in the United States, we had a lot of things happen. Again, stuff that your U.S. history class should be covering. But this wasn't just something that was emotional in the United States. The Vietnam conflict was something that the entire world was looking at. All countries were looking at. Because everybody knew in the end, it was essentially the Soviet Union versus the United States. And North Korea and South Korea are kind of being puppets. So, again, I have lots of stories I like to tell with these things, but I'm moving on here. Now, this one, again, is one of those ones you didn't hear about much because of the Iron Curtain. You don't hear about much what happens on the other side. In fact, this picture is quite famous because it got through the Iron Curtain. This is one of those interesting things where what happens here is in 1968, Prague is one of the main cities, or the capital city of Czechoslovakia at the time. Today it's the capital of the Czech Republic, because Czechoslovakia is divided into two, Czech Republic and Slovakia. But the government of Czechoslovakia was like, you know what, Soviet-style communism and socialism just isn't working out very well. We actually have some ideas where we think it will work out a little bit better. But we know if we just enact these, the Soviets will probably just send in the tanks like they have everywhere else. So let's ask their permission first and see what happens. So the leader of Czechoslovakia, the socialist communist leader of Czechoslovakia, goes to the ambassador, the Soviet ambassador, a guy named Brezhnev, and asks him, hey, we have these ideas to make Czechoslovakia a better socialist state because they're not working out well, and we think that if we did this, we could prove things better and show that socialism is a great thing. And Brezhnev told the Czechoslovakian leader, like, oh, this would be great. Way to go, trying to make socialism look a lot better in the eyes of the world. And it's like, I'll go tell the Politburo, the leaders of the Soviet Union. And so he goes over there, and instead of saying, hey, the Czechs are actually got some good ideas, he tells them, oh, the Czechs are in full rebellion. They have ideas that we don't like. Send in the tanks. And all of a sudden, even though Brezhnev told the Czech leader, the Czechoslovakian leader, go ahead and do this, they still send in the tanks because it's just not going along with what the Soviets want. Totalitarian control, basically. Now, no one was ever supposed to know that this happened, but this picture did get out to the West, and of course, Western nations like the United States and France are like, "What are you doing, Soviet Union? You're doing this again." Anyways, so I am not going to talk about this guy right now. If you do not know about him, his name is Che Guevara. He is a highly controversial figure in the world today. He is. I don't know if I want to say go look it up, because it depends which website or which source you're going to, because a lot of people will say this guy is the greatest guy ever. A lot of places will say this is the guy's the worst guy ever. I will say, though, from an American point of view, this guy is not a good guy. From an American point of view, one of his goals in life was the downfall of the United States. He wanted to see us go down. He helped Fidel Castro in the Cuban Revolution. He killed lots of people for what he believed in. And what he believed in was in direct contradiction to, say, American ideals of freedom and liberty. I'm just said I wasn't going to go into this, and I just went into this a little bit, and I definitely went into it in a biased way. So take it from the other side, this guy is viewed as kind of like a revolutionary hero today to some, especially in Latin American countries, and definitely to people that lean more on the socialist communist side. Anyways. I'm just going to pass this up because I tell the story about how Che Guevara basically was successful in areas, was not so successful in other areas, and ultimately was found out by the Bolivian military, most likely with help from the CIA. I don't know if that's official yet or not, but most likely help with the American CIA and the Bolivian military took him out. But the reason I show this is that there's still stories today that El Che is alive. Even with seeing that, I will get out the picture there, but El Che is still alive. You know, kind of like Elvis is still alive. There's a lot of that out there. Anyways, said I wasn't going to go into Che, and I just did a little bit, and that was all intro stuff, and yes, I was being biased a bit there. I apologize there. Now, going into one of the last major hotspots, we're going to talk about Afghanistan. And no, we're not talking about Afghanistan with the United States there. If you do not know this, Afghanistan was a major hotspot for the Soviet Union. Basically what happens in Afghanistan is Afghanistan has a pro-communist government getting control. Did not necessarily have the support of all the people, but enough. Or at least enough of the power, a lot of force behind them. And they take over. A lot of the people don't like this, and so they lead a revolt against the Soviet-backed communist government of Afghanistan. And we, the United States and others, see an opportunity to do to the Soviet Union what they did to us in Korea and Vietnam. They supplied weapons and things like that and got a lot of Americans killed, and made places like Korea and Vietnam more of a hellhole than it would have been, you could say. We supplied a lot of weapons and materials to the rebels, the rebels going against the communist government of Afghanistan. By the way, these are a lot of the rebels that we helped essentially. I'm not going to go into this picture. I usually like to. It's one of the more famous pictures of all time. Time magazine cover of one of the refugees. This is one of those ideas like her eyes tell it all type thing. Anyways, this picture is actually taken by a member of the U.S. military while in the war in Afghanistan for our war in Afghanistan. That's been going on pretty much for the last almost 20 years, 19 years here. In 2001 to 2020, it's still going. But there are relics of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. That's an old Soviet tank that's still it's just sitting there from when it was destroyed in the Soviet-Afghan war. So, and the Soviets get crushed by this one. They pretty much have to pull out of there like we had to pull out of Vietnam. Now we know that didn't really go that well in Afghanistan because you had another radical group take over, Islamic group called the Taliban take over after this. And that didn't go very well for us, going into the bombing of the two towers and then harboring Osama bin Laden, but that's a whole different story. That's beyond the Cold War. Sorry. So, now, I'm going to end this video at this point. Yes, I guess I was right at the beginning. This will not be the end of the unit. We'll have one more video on how the Cold War comes to an end. This was just basically the video on the hotspots. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next part of this lesson, the last part of this lesson.